The standing ovation. The tears. Simon Cowell calling him the next Pavarotti.
At 17, Jonathan Antoine stood on the Britain's Got Talent stage as the most unlikely of stars, a self-harming, deeply depressed teen who had been suicidal just months earlier. But his duet with Charlotte didn't just win over the nation.
It cracked open something much deeper.
Because behind the golden voice and the record deal, Jonathan was silently battling an invisible war that would eventually cost him everything he'd built.
Before we uncover what really happened, tell us in the comments, what do you think is the biggest misunderstanding about this story?
The boy who walked onto the Britain's Got Talent stage in 2012 was barely visible beneath the weight of his own despair. At 17, Jonathan Antoine had already mapped out his final exit, plans to end a life he felt was going nowhere.
Dropped out of sixth form. Directionless.
Parents terrified to leave him alone in case he acted on the dark thoughts that consumed him night after night. Self-harm had become a grim ritual, a way to transform unbearable emotional agony into something physical, something he could control. He'd been bullied relentlessly since childhood, othered because of his weight, diagnosed with depression that left him feeling like he was trapped on a roller coaster heading only upward, waiting for a catastrophic drop that eventually came. Then came a BlackBerry message from a friend from music class. Charlotte Giaconelli had applied for Britain's Got Talent and wanted him to audition with her. At first, his mother tried to stop him, he was in no state for public scrutiny.
But Jonathan had already stopped caring about anything.
He had nothing left to lose. When they stepped onto that stage at the Hammersmith Apollo, Simon Cowell barely looked up from his notes, whispering to a guest judge that this was going to be a train wreck.
But then Jonathan opened his mouth.
What emerged was a voice that stopped time, an operatic tenor of such raw, shocking power that it silenced the jeers and brought the audience to its feet.
Cowell called it the most astonishing voice he'd heard in years, comparing it to Luciano Pavarotti.
But here's where the story takes its first impossible turn. In that moment of triumph, when the world was finally seeing him, Jonathan was already preparing for a different kind of battle, one that would unfold not on stage, but in the suffocating silence of his own mind. And it would test him far more than any judge's verdict ever could.
If you're enjoying this story, subscribe so you never miss our next documentary.
The moment Jonathan Antoine walked off that Britain's Got Talent stage, his life ceased to be his own. Within days, Simon Cowell's label Psycho had offered the duo a £1 million record deal. Their debut album together shot to number 5 in the UK charts. They sold more than 250,000 records. Jonathan, who had been planning his own funeral months earlier, was suddenly the youngest tenor ever to have a classical number 1. But here's the thing about being launched out of depression by a whirlwind: when the storm settles, you're still left standing in the wreckage of who you used to be. He later admitted the show saved his life, but not in the way people imagine. It wasn't the fame or the money that pulled him back from the edge.
It was Charlotte. She was the one that put me up for BGT, he confessed. Without Charlotte, I never would have been on that stage in the first place. Maybe I wouldn't even be here.
Simon Cowell had famously told Jonathan to ditch Charlotte and go solo, but Jonathan refused.
The media called it loyalty.
The truth was far more fragile. He was in such a dark place that he couldn't have stepped onto that stage without her beside him. For 2 years, they were inseparable.
2 albums.
A whirlwind of tours, TV appearances, and public adoration. But behind the scenes, the cracks were already forming. In 2014, the duo sat down with Sony to discuss their third album and realized they couldn't agree on a single song.
The label suggested they go solo instead.
Charlotte was scared but ready. Jonathan, however, was about to face something far more devastating than creative differences. Because when the partnership ended, so did the lifeline that had kept him afloat. And the crash that followed would nearly destroy him completely. If this story surprised you, share it with someone who would enjoy uncovering forgotten Hollywood stories.
For years, Jonathan Antoine had been searching for an explanation. He had always felt different.
School was a battlefield, not just because of the bullying, but because his brain processed the world in ways he couldn't articulate. He'd look at other people, what society called normal, and wonder why everything seemed so much harder for him. The weight struggles that began at age 4.
The social isolation. The depression that wrapped around him like a second skin.
And then, in 2022, just after his 27th birthday, the answer finally arrived. Jonathan was diagnosed with autism. And suddenly, a lifetime of confusion began to make sense. He later described the diagnosis as disorienting, like falling into a daydream, recontextualizing an entire life already lived. Everything clicked into place: the sensory sensitivities, the difficulty navigating social situations, the way he'd always processed emotions differently from those around him. Looking back, he realized that the breakdown he suffered in 2014, when he was just 21 and starting his solo career, wasn't just depression. It was an autistic meltdown, one he didn't have the vocabulary to understand at the time. His mother had always suspected something, because mothers always know. But it took nearly 3 decades for the official confirmation. The diagnosis was liberating. But it also forced Jonathan to reckon with something uncomfortable: how much of his pain could have been avoided if he'd known earlier. The bullying. The self-harm. The suicide plans. The years of feeling broken when he was simply wired differently. In a way, the diagnosis gave him permission to stop apologizing for who he was. And it also gave him a new mission. Since revealing his autism publicly, he has used his platform to advocate for neurodiversity, encouraging others to seek understanding rather than judgment. He collaborated with fellow autistic tenor Helmut Lotti, bonding over their shared experiences. He wrote a children's book, Jonathan the Porcupine, inspired by his own bullying, to help young readers understand self-worth and empathy. But as Jonathan would be the first to admit, a diagnosis doesn't erase the past. It simply reframes it. If this story surprised you, share it with someone who would enjoy uncovering forgotten Hollywood stories. Today, Jonathan Antoine is not the shy teenager who once struggled to make eye contact on the Britain's Got Talent stage. He's a 31-year-old man who has finally made peace with the person he always was. The diagnosis that came in 2022, autism, didn't change him. It simply gave him the language to understand a lifetime of feeling out of sync with the world. And it gave him permission to stop apologizing for it. As he put it in a recent interview, the diagnosis helped him understand himself and how he sees the world. For the first time, he feels he can truly speak to people through his music. The proof is in his latest work. In March 2026, Jonathan released Speaking to You, an album born from this new era of self-acceptance. Recorded between Los Angeles and London, including the legendary Angel Studios, it represents a departure from the classical crossover sound that made him famous. He's unafraid to be open now, creating songs that offer comfort, honesty, and emotional connection with a splash of his fun, eccentric side. But perhaps the most remarkable chapter of his recent story involves 2 fans, known as Fantoins, who were in comas. Jonathan's music was played for them. And they woke up. It's earned him the nickname, the Coma Whisperer, a title he carries with a mixture of humility and wonder. It's such a privilege to be played at all points of people's lives: weddings, funerals, baptisms, breakups, during chemotherapy, during comas, he reflects. His voice, the very thing that once felt like his only escape, has become a lifeline for others. He's also channeled his experiences into advocacy. The children's book Jonathan the Porcupine, inspired by his own bullying, aims to teach young readers about empathy and self-worth. He's spoken openly about his autism in the hope of helping others, inspired by fellow artists like Louis Capaldi who've been transparent about their neurodivergence. Getting more informed about neurodivergence, about the many different types of people that exist on the planet, that is incredibly valuable, he says. His mother, Tracy, has watched this transformation with pride, noting that the real Jonathan is funny, kind, and charming, nothing like the shy figure audiences saw on television all those years ago. So what really happened to Jonathan Antoine? He didn't fade away. He didn't become a cautionary tale. Instead, he did something far more remarkable: he survived. He dug himself out of the darkness that threatened to consume him and emerged not just intact, but more authentic than ever. The boy who once planned his own funeral is now a man who wakes people from comas. And he's still singing. If you enjoyed this documentary, like the video and subscribe for more true celebrity stories every week.